And we're from Wireless London, and this is the first in three talk series that's happening in collaboration with the Architectural Association. That's beginning to look at future urban infrastructures, and particularly the relationship between wireless technologies and architecture. The talk series is part of a wider project, which is called Wireless London, which our colleague Julian Priest will be introducing in a moment. The project is funded by the Arts Council of England, and it will be running between now and March, and Wireless London will be extending beyond that with projects and other events that will be taking place during that period and beyond.
So the only other thing to mention really is the dates to put in your diaries now, or maybe you should wait and see if you enjoy the talk and then decide whether or not you're going to put them in your diaries. But the 15th of February and the 15th of March will be the dates of the next two talks. And we should probably apologise a little bit for that. Some people have asked about the verses. We put on the publicity that this was Armin Medosch versus Usman, Haque, and it's not really going to get that ugly, or at least I don't think so. It might do, I don't know. We never know. But
the aim was really to look at the relationship between wireless practitioners who we speculate are beginning to operate at an urban scale and begin to adopt architectural methodologies, and architects who are already working within that field. And the aim is to put the two approaches together and see where the common ground occurs. Now, the format of all the talks is the same. There's one architect and one non-architect that will be speaking in half an hour each, followed by half an hour of open discussion, where we'd actively encourage as many questions about the relationship and practice of these two areas as possible. We particularly want to break down people just listening to a talk and then going away. So we particularly want to get people to ask questions of each other and the things they think and where these areas cross over and where they don't. And then following that, 8 o'clock in the restaurant area downstairs, and this is true of all of the talks, there'll be an open show and tell where people can show work in and around the field, in this field, either work in progress or on a technological design or any other level they wish to show.
And that's kicking off this month. But if any of you have projects that you would like to show in this area in a very broad sense, then next month we're hoping to develop a kind of hive atmosphere downstairs of lots of different things happening and people showing things and demonstrating whatever they're doing. So do approach us if you have anything to show. The other thing that we should say before we hand over to Julian is just thanks very much to the Architectural Association for hosting this series of talks. They've been really excellent in providing both the space, the context, and also proposing the three talks by architects. The non-architects we've selected, and I think non-architects might be a euphemism for something, or we're not quite sure what non-architects means, but that's what we're working with at the moment.
The two speakers this evening are Armin Medosch, who will be introduced in a moment, and Usman Haque. And we'd like to introduce Julian Priest, who wrote a report called The State of Wireless London, which has essentially spawned this entire series and this particular project. So, Julian Priest.
Thanks, Saul and Pete. As they both said, I've wrote a study last year called The State of Wireless London, which was aimed to look at what had happened to wireless networking technology in the 4 or 5 years since it was introduced around 2000. And my involvement with wireless networking was that I started with James Stevens a project called Consume.net back in at the beginning of 2000, which aimed to build a distributedly owned metropolitan wireless infrastructure, and that journey ended up spawning an international movement of free networkers, but more importantly, it was maybe the first visible, one of the first visible expressions of what wireless networking could do. So last year I took a chance to look back at the work that we've been doing and see what the state of wireless wireless was in London, and to map this layer of wireless networking activity onto the familiar boundaries and forms of London. So I looked at three types of networkers. The free networkers, kind of hacktivist amateurs and technologists, people with an interest in building their own wireless networks, which are represented by the green dots here. And then commercial providers. Wireless networking was taken up heavily by all kinds of telcos looking for a way out of their troubles and into some kind of revenue stream that they thought might exist, which didn't seem to appear. But there was a huge amount of activity from commercial network providers providing Wi-Fi hotspots across the city, which are represented by all the other coloured dots. And then public bodies such as councils and other public bodies have also taken up wireless and used it for their own ends. So I was drawing these. You can see the boroughs of Lewisham, Newham, Westminster, and many others have taken up their own wireless pilot projects. The most interesting thing was that we found was that the last layer on the map is this blue trail that runs across the city, which was a trip that James took in the Flying Eye with Capital Radio to Air Stumble, London, and he turned up thousands of wireless access points, broadcasting their whereabouts into the air, and picked them up from the aeroplane. We did some calculations on what that meant for the density of wireless networking activity in London, and it showed that there's in excess of approximately 20,000 access points that could be seen from that limited stumble, and that number's growing all the time. I'm informed that there's now a wireless networking section in B&Q, so it seems as though now is a really good time for us to look at where wireless has gone and how it's begun to have an impact in wider society, and that's the idea of the Wireless London series of talks. So with that out of the way, I'm going to pass you over to Armin Medosch, who's a writer and free network commentator and user with very much experience, and author of the book Freinetze, if I pronounce it correctly, which is published under Creative Commons license in Germany. And he's going to talk about the background of wireless and its deeper range history. So with no further ado, I'll pass him over to you and get his slides up.
Good evening. First, sorry that I have to sit here using a bar stool because I had a little accident over the festive period. I want to thank the organizers of Wireless London for having me here, and also want to thank the Architectural Association. It's a great pleasure to be in this wonderful building. I'm not sure if I'm actually able to do what has been promised, namely to talk a lot about the relationship between architecture and wireless communication infrastructures. There is certainly a certain type of relationship, but in a kind of more utopian, speculative way, where many people nowadays talk about information architecture and the like. I'm a very skeptical person, and almost maybe a conservative, and maybe Usman doesn't like that, and I'm already coming to the versus aspect, but maybe architects should really focus on making nice buildings and stay away from information architecture and that whole sloganism that we have seen in architecture over the last year, where a lot of terminology from the kind of computer science and science of complexity and other areas has been taken and adapted into an architectural discourse where it is maybe giving nice kind of verbal decoration, but in the end, it's about buildings, I guess. So this is my only comment on this level, and now to the subject. I have here chosen this picture, which I like for a certain reason, because it's just kind of opposes so nicely. On the left side, on this chimney, you see an antenna. That's an omnidirectional antenna for a wireless computer network. That means it sends and receives waves in all directions. On the far right, you can see the Canary Wharf, this shining example of Thatcherism, and also it stands for the global city, maybe as Saskia Sassen has analyzed it. And also we know that a lot of media institutions and financial institutions are in that building, where it is all about the control of information flows, the control of airwaves. And in the middle, we somehow conspicuously have the church with its spire. And let's just say, here in this picture, the church stands for the sacred space, those spaces that we kind of still leave untouched in an urban area where we have less and less public space, or where the notion of public space is almost completely gone. And if not gone, it's seriously undermined by these new communication technologies, by having CCTV everywhere, by a total collapse in categories between what it means to be private or in public when we run around constantly carrying mobile phones and the like. So on the left, this little antenna stands for what Julian already commented on, the movement. It's a kind of grassroots movement of free networkers that came into existence over the last 5-6 years. And this stands for a very different interpretation of the media sphere. So it is really maybe not in opposition to the Canary Wharf and what it stands for, but maybe it really shows an alternative way out. But here I come to the central theme of my talk. For those who can't read, it's because it's too small. Here it says, the wireless era will create a state like the socialist dream. And this is an illustration of an American technological magazine, which was printed in 1910. That is just 13 years after Marconi invented the wireless telegraph. And at that time, in the United States, but also in England, you had a veritable hype of wireless technologies. I don't show this old picture to say that everything repeats itself, which is a kind of stupid phrase. History doesn't really repeat itself. But what is important here is, if we look at the history of modernity, if we look at the history of communication technologies, we see certain figures, certain metaphors, certain central tropes coming out again and again. And one of these very central tropes is that new communication technologies always kind of give rise to many utopian hopes. So this is a very kind of central figure in modernity. We had it with wireless, with the radio, with television, with the internet, on and again. Every new communications technology gives rise to, I would even say, utopianisms in the plural. I have looked into this a little bit, and there is, for instance, the kind of social democratic utopianism, which is the idea that a better use of communication technologies, that an improvement in communication technologies will automatically lead to a fairer, more just, more informed, and thereby ultimately more democratic society. So that's kind of one central figure. Another figure is also just the constant expansion of the realm of the technological. It's about the domination of the forces of nature by technology, and that in the service of the economy. So it's about economic growth. It's about unlimited economic growth, about 500% growth figures, and that's what people believed in 1910. It somehow was the same what people believed with the internet hype, so that with the internet hype for years you would have those exponentially high growth rates. And then, already then, in the early 1900s, there was a third type of utopianism, which was, I would call it the artistic utopianism. It was the utopianism by the Russian futurists who wrote poems and manifestos about the wireless era, who thought that with electromagnetic radio waves you could create world peace, you could cure illnesses, you could heal the mentally ill. And in Italy, Marinetti wrote his radio manifest, Il Radiasta, where he thought that art had become so conservative under the influence of the bourgeoisie or the middle class that it only deserves to die. But with radio waves, with radio and television, art could completely be set free, and a very different type of art could be invented. Of course, we know that radio and television did not really go down that road of becoming this totally liberating artistic experiences, and have become rather dull and oppressive kind of media channels which only serve for the marketing of products and disinformation. But there was also another type of utopianism which was formulated by Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright and communist, and he said the first mistake was that at the radio they had taken away the transmitter. So basically, if you have a radio, you have a transmitter and a receiver, and for the consumer, what was left over was only the receiver. In the beginning, every radio was a transceiver, a transmitter and receiver. But during the 1920s, after the First World War, they started selling radios as consumer products, and they just had forgot to build into the radio that part where you could also transmit your own programs. So the airways became heavily controlled, and the kind of modern consumer was born, the consumer of news, the consumer of opera, of jazz, of all this kind of information and cultural products. This kind of artistic vision of the two-way communication that Brecht formulated in his radio manifesto was only surpassed by the complete utopianism of Nikola Tesla, who was a scientist who contributed a lot to the early history of radio, and he had an even bigger dream. He thought that we somehow could tap into the ether and create energy more or less from nothing, from the gravitational field of the Earth, and that that we could transmit energy wirelessly. So he had this utopia of free energy, enough energy for everybody for free, which of course created a conspiracy theory, which is that General Electric and Henry Ford and so on, they squashed Tesla's inventions and made it vanish, and he was driven into madness and poverty and so on. But anyway, this engineer's utopia is maybe something that reminds me a little bit of these attempts here of those hacktivists working in the area of free network. Now, what you already had then, you had the wireless DIY activists. So Mr. William Dubilier is talking from Seattle to Tacoma, a distance of 35 miles over his wireless telephone. Such early experiments created a wireless hype around wireless technologies. So people started fraudulent stock market schemes and started selling wireless telephony approximately 80 years before it became technologically really viable. So they started to sell something like a virtual mobile phone company on the stock market in New York. Meanwhile, 100 years have gone by, and somehow the utopianism of the futurists is gone. A lot of the speculation has gone, but it has been replaced by solid science. So this is a galaxy relatively shortly after its moment of birth. With radio telescopes we can observe such events which are not just only very deep in space, they are also going very back in time. We can look from Earth very deep into space. We can also look from space onto Earth, and these wireless technologies help to create a new image of the world, which is not really photography, but this is a heavy data image that has, I think, 32 layers of data which are being brought together here to create this image. This is the International Space Station, and this is the Slovenian Space Station. I contrast those two just to show that everything they can do with that very expensive project up in space, maybe it's much nicer if artists do it here down on Earth, where somebody is working with cheap technology, with technology which you can control, where you can get your own hands on it, and where actually as an artist you really have the ability to experiment and explore and create interesting things rather than working with the high-tech apparatus of NASA. For all this, what you need is electromagnetic spectrum. So this is a spectrum map. So after the early days of experiments, what emerged is a form of spectrum regulation where the state, in the interest of the citizen, gives chunks of the spectrum to different organizations or companies or state institutions, and they then can use this spectrum. So all these are different parts of electromagnetic spectrum, from very low waves to very high frequencies, and just in between, somewhere in the middle, is a very tiny bit which is called the, what's it called? Help me out, please. The industrial, medical, and yeah, thank you. So this is a small exception from the rule that spectrum is treated like property, and there's a small part where the spectrum is not property but is like a commons. It can be used by everybody. And this exception from the rule actually enabled this boom in wireless data technologies that we currently see now, and also enables activists to build free infrastructures. Somewhere else in that same spectrum map, you have the wireless spectrum which is used by the mobile phone companies. And after we had this whole hype about the internet, which with very high growth rates and this kind of techno-utopianism, commercial techno-utopianism about the internet, which led to the boom and the bust, currently it's the wireless technologies which give rise to another boom. So here it's with mobile telephonies, it's the hopes that are being set on the third generation 3G mobile telephones, which can transmit video and all kinds of new services and so on and so on. So here is another techno-utopian commercial boom, and I think it is very interesting because those mobile phone companies were made to pay huge sums for the use of spectrum. So the state made an auction and 5 companies entered the bid, and they ended up paying something like £22 billion for the right to use this spectrum. Plus, they also have to make an investment to upgrade their networks, and now we slowly see more of these networks coming online. Because all that is so expensive, they have to get the maximum out of their networks. So they really have to milk the consumer cow now. So this is something that's anthropologically, socially very interesting to see how the product mobile phone is structured. Because the way this works in consumerism is that an ideal customer is being imagined. It's not just one customer, there are many different customers, so it's highly customized, trying to satisfy every potential whim and whiff of any kind of consumer. You get a lot of stereotyping. So for instance, here on the left you see the woman is very concerned with imaging. In the center you have this man who is a bit unshaved, and he's probably the embodiment of the modern road warrior. He's somebody who doesn't need to stay in the office anymore. He can do business all the time. He's always connected, so that's why he doesn't have to shave anymore. And that really gives him the edge. And on the right side, I don't really know exactly what to make about the relations in those exceptional applications over there. This is a little bit of a presentational breakdown, but actually the idea was to show an image of the internet distribution per population, which would show North America as this huge thing. Africa almost doesn't exist. Europe has a few high towers, and then there is Japan somewhere over there. And So on one hand, you have this techno-utopianism. On the other hand, you have a reality on the ground that this is still only really taking off in the really overdeveloped, super highly industrialized countries who are taking full advantage of the so-called information revolution. What we always need to do is, when we talk about networks, it's very different from architecture. It's called topology, but it's another type of topology. It's a mathematical topology of graphs. So here you have nodes which are connected with edges, and different network topologies imply different things. I need to say here that I'm quite influenced recently by Michel Serres, who wrote this wonderful book about the parasite, where he basically says that human society is parasitic, and I think this fits so perfectly for networks. So here on the left side, you have the conventional network topology, the star topology, which is used by normal landline phone companies, but which is also in a structural organizational way employed by mobile phone companies. So here, the organization is like the octopus, which sits in the center and which controls all elements of the network. Yeah? So this is the parasite. The company is at the center, puts itself at the central point of all dissemination of information, of all information flows. And because it occupies that central point, it can actually skim off the surplus revenue from the users. So it is about human communication, but our very basic need of communication is being channeled into this model where you have the octopus sitting at the center of the network and controlling every aspect of it. On the right, you have the so-called distributed or mesh network, which is originally the way the internet was structured. It's an idealization. It's not really true anymore these days, but you see this is a very different network where nodes can be connected in various ways, and there is no such a central position where an octopus could place himself and attract all this money, power, and surplus revenue. So the meshed network structure of the internet enabled its explosive growth, and circa 99 the internet was probably looking like that. We were all told, again, this techno-utopian story about how the internet automatically would lead to more democratic society, how everybody would become so empowered, and so on and so on. And of course it is not really happening like that. Meanwhile, the kind of new economy has fallen on its nose, and a lot of those utopian ideas have also gone out of the window. What I'm doing is I'm not attacking the utopian ideas. What I'm attacking is this central figure of technological determinism, which is that it says if you have a meshed network which is decentralized, you will automatically have a meshed society, a decentralized bottom-up society, that you put up the layer of the network of communication and directly impose it on a social layer or on a political layer. And this kind of causal link between a type of communication network or a type of social organization and the actual real workings of power and power relations, this is just something that's not true. Yeah? That's a very important thing. Maybe we can discuss a little bit how this technological determinism is coming through always in our society in so many ways and in so many layers. So what I try to say is, and here the free networks, I meanwhile use it more as an example almost, is that you actually can achieve that. You can use decentralized communication technologies to have a widely hierarchy-free type of social organization. This can be done, but only if it's made a project, only if it's a declared and intentional project, and if people with all their human agency and effort and willpower work on this project together, and not in any kind of automatism or kind of because there's the ghost in the machine and then things just become like that. So let's just skip this. Let's start with this project of having a bottom-up, self-defined grassroots society of people who reverse the parasitic model. Now the internet service provider is not the parasite at the center of the network who gets everything. Now the host is actually somebody who gives bandwidth, and we, the users, become the parasites. But because it's a voluntary giving, it's not such a negative thing, actually. So how does this happen? It happens through collaboration. Usually no money is exchanged, but that doesn't mean that there is no exchange. So there are different types of exchanges, different economies, you can say, even so there's usually no money involved. Something happened here with the transfer of images. This is the animal of the GNU Foundation, which invented the principle behind free software, which is another way of having an exchange where no money changes hands. Free software is based on the principle that every software that is written under this free software license, the GPL, can be copied by everybody and can also be modified and redistributed by everybody. Free software is a condition for free networks to exist. Without free software, you couldn't make any free networks. Now, very briefly, how long have I got? Okay, very briefly about the technology. What do you need to create a wireless network? Let's first call a spade a spade. So the thing is not really wireless LAN or Wi-Fi. All these are different industry terms. Properly in engineering terms, it's called 802.11. That's a family of protocols that has been developed. The development has come out of a lot of amateur radio people who developed packet radio already in the 1970s and 80s. And this has been perfected in the late 80s, and then in the 1990s a proper standardization process began, and in 1997 the first 802.11 standard was released, and that enabled companies to build wireless network cards. Maybe we can show one. So basically, if you have a laptop, you just need a wireless network card, put it in, and then you are able to show a wireless network. Now, many of the newer laptops have this already built into the chipset, so you don't even need this anymore. That's how quickly things change. In 1999, such a card would have cost around 100 quid. I think now you can get it for a tenner, or you get it for free if you buy a cup of coffee, or I don't know. But that's also part of this techno-utopianism in the capitalist model, is that you can produce something in big numbers and the price comes down. And this is also something which makes this kind of wireless grassroots revolution now possible. We must also see that. Yeah? This is not just coming from somebody's garage. There is Intel inside, or if it's not Intel, it's a Taiwanese company or ASUS or whatever. So busy people in foreign countries have put this thing together on very low wages. Feel guilty. Now, one basic topological thing is that if you have a computer with a wireless card, it has only a certain range. Yeah? The power that you can use, the transmission power, is very low, so you can only have a certain range. But what you can do is you can use, like in this case here, the computer B works as a hub for A and C to communicate with each other. So computers who are not in range of each other can communicate still if there is one hub in between that all participants can reach. Now, this is the so-called peer-to-peer model. Many people have heard about peer-to-peer file sharing on the internet. Again, you don't have a centralized server. Every participant opens a little part of their hard disk and lets other people participate. This peer-to-peer model of file sharing is used also in the free network model. It's being used here to create an infrastructure. So it's a very different kind of thing. Peer-to-peer, the file sharing, to my opinion, has become very opportunistic and parasitic again, because most people are not uploading, just downloading. And so it's not really something I would glorify or so. But I hope you understand the basic principle behind it, the different network topology. Now apply that to wireless network. You can see here you have a range of nodes, graphic design supplied by Julian Priest, thank you. And you can see all these nodes, which when they overlap together, they can create a network. Yeah? Now, the advantage of this network is that it's entirely free. It's free as the air that we breathe. I'm not sure if the air is still free, I mean, with the Kyoto Protocol and everything like that. But this network does not use any proprietary things such as cables owned by British Telecom or Televest or anybody else. So a network which is composed of such wireless nodes, which are all run by individuals who somehow subscribe to the community wireless model, is an entirely free network. And in that network, you have a relatively high bandwidth. With the older 802.11b protocol, you could have 11 Mbit. That means you can exchange here live audio, live video. You can use all kinds of high bandwidth applications. That's really no problem anymore. And you don't have to pay to anyone. That's the kind of free, as in free beer, argument. Of course, if you want to have internet access, this still needs to have a pipe towards the internet so that all the people who are on this network can also share the kind of many things that you can get on the global internet. But I think what we have tried to emphasize in the free network community is very much also what you can do within that free network cloud. For instance, you can use internet telephony. You can have conference connections absolutely for free where you speak to each other. You can almost replace the local phone systems. There are certain technological speculative developments where you could build such free network technology into mobile phone handsets, where you could make a local free telephone system. So these are seeds of the ideas. It's not that anybody says, okay, this will beat the telecoms, or it's about David against Goliath and all this kind of thing. These are seeds of seeds of ideas, and maybe those seeds will sprout. Now, this is a screenshot of the currently not active consume node database. We will hear a little bit more about that later. But this, until recently, worked pretty well, and you could just put in a postcode and you could see where wireless free network nodes are. And again, where you can see those overlapping circles, maybe you have a local cluster of free networks who collaborate, who make this mesh network, and where people are in such an exchange in a local wireless infrastructure. So that's the kind of semi-high-tech version. A real high-tech version will follow soon, but you can also do it just like that. A hand-drawn map where the basic act is, if you want to participate in something like that, is to say, I am here. That was a slogan used by Mute magazine in those days in 2002. It was called You Are Here. Put yourself on the map. Put yourself on the spot. Say, I'm here and I want to make connections with other people. I want to see what other people here have to offer, what kind of intellectual goods, what kind of commodities, or what kind of non-commodities. Does somebody want to go play football in the park, or does somebody have some old desks to be thrown out, and so on. So this network, this You Are Here network, means to stimulate a lot of local contact, actually, and local community interaction on the basis of this wireless free networking project. Here we have another part of the activity, which is installing antennas. It's a very popular activity. You can see James Stevens. He's there he is. Illegal on a roof in the East End, or is that Greenwich? Anyway, what you need to connect over longer distances, over short distance, all you need is the radio card. Over longer distance, you need to have an antenna. And here in the beginning, people really liked a lot those DIY workshops where people built antennas together. Meanwhile, maybe it doesn't make that much sense because also the prices of industry antennas have come down, so you can get antennas cheaply. But these are homemade antennas where for the material cost of a few pounds, you can make a perfectly long-range directional antenna where you can bridge distances of 1, 2, 3 miles if the antenna is well constructed and if it's well adjusted. So here we see that act where maybe I said that's the only point that relates to architecture. It's suddenly you get a lot of attention for roofs and for connections between roofs, because For this very weak signal to reach another signal, you need a line of sight. So that means high buildings are very popular. People who live in high buildings are very popular, and and this is how those connections can grow from one hop to the next. And this is Adam Burns from Free to Air, who is checking if he can maybe connect with his mate Alex Seblinov, who's a bit further up in the Dalston area. Now, this is the ideal. That's the consume node database from the bird's eye view, and you see here green pastures, grey skies. So that's England, seen from this kind of perspective, and totally covered by consume-style free network nodes. Of course, that's slightly fictional, but who knows? As Julian has pointed out, many people have this gear at home and are using it. They just don't know about the project of free network as a kind of social utopia, which is not a techno-utopia, not just another wireless techno-utopia, but a project which is formulated as a project and has other aspects, and I'm told not to talk too much anymore, but which are very important. For instance, it's in such a network you also need rules. It can't work without any rules at all. This idea of this kind of ideal cyber libertarianism doesn't work. So people have been sitting together and their brains started to smoke, and they have created the Pico-Beering Agreement, which is a kind of framework for free networks, how to create their own rules, how to self-manage. And this is where I say, in this consumer society that is totally driven by techno-utopian ideas, that this kind of project of a self-instituted free network and all the kind of processes that it involves contains the seed of a social transgression up to some other model of a society which is maybe more based on collaboration rather than social Darwinism and competitiveness and all these kinds of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armin. That was a fascinating talk. I won't delay any longer, but I'll introduce you to Usman Haque, who's an architect who works with interactive systems. He's one of the only architects I know who specifically works within the realms of signal and building and shaping and thinking about signal as in various kinds as a component of architecture. I think it will be interesting to hear what he has to say in the context of this, in the context of design and building. We'll have time for questions from both Armin and Usman, and across the group following Usman's talk.
But do feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or comments. Can you hear me if I talk like this? My wireless is working okay. I tend to move a little bit. I want to talk to you actually not specifically about networks, partly because Armin has already spoken quite eloquently about it. I want to actually talk about electromagnetic space in general, particularly as it relates to architecture. I'm more interested in the idea of fields than I am in networks, partly because networks for me conjure up this idea of points and connections, whereas fields sort of suggest something more continuous, more sort of pervasive. And the reason I'm interested in this aspect of electromagnetic space is because I think there are certain aspects of electromagnetic space that actually shape us or affect us and are shaped by us in much the same way that traditional architectural elements are. Apologies, by the way, I should say, for the supposed non-architects. I'm not actually going to talk about buildings. I'm going to talk about what I consider architecture, which is not necessarily this hard stuff, but is actually the space, the designed space, if you like. I think thinking about the architecture of electromagnetic space encourages us to get away from this idea of static structures, silent static structures, and to think more about a sort of continuous, fluid, dynamic system, which really is, for me, what I think architecture is. It's electromagnetic space is, when I'm not talking about light, electromagnetic space is something that exists just beyond the edge of our natural perceptions, but which affects us physically. And the important thing about electromagnetic space is that we're all both consumers and contributors to this space. So it affects us, but we also produce electromagnetic fields ourselves. Understanding that has consequences, of course, for the way that we relate to space. And these are the sorts of things that I want to talk about. I actually titled my presentation Invisible Topographies from a piece I wrote a couple of years ago, where I talked about what I call the invisible topographies of Hertzian space. If I could just talk about each of those concepts for a second. Invisible. I'll show you the same map that Armin showed you earlier. This is, as he said, the frequency allocation. But I'm not actually interested in that, although I am kind of. I'm interested in this little one down here. All of that is what you would call the electromagnetic spectrum. This portion here is the radio spectrum, which is shown up there, which has been allocated by various government institutions and things like that. Down at this end, we have the very low frequency electromagnetic, I'll call it EMF from now on, if you don't mind. Up here, we have infrared, we have the visual spectrum, which is, of course, light, because light is the electromagnetic. And getting on there, we've got gamma rays, cosmic rays, all that kind of thing. Why am I interested in the invisible stuff, purely the invisible aspects of electromagnetic fields? Well, there was a description that Paul Shepard gave. In answer to the question, what is architecture? He said, I think it's about things being invisible but still having a character. So that's, I think, what brings me to this, this territory. Particularly what I'm going to be talking about today are things like mobile phones. I'm going to be talking a little bit about GPS and RFID, and I'm going to be talking about 802.11 networks. But I'm going to be talking about them in terms of fields, not networks. Topographies. It's important to realize that when we talk about electromagnetic space, we're talking about something physical. It is real. We can measure it. There's a landscape out there that we can actually sense with our instruments. It's not virtual. It exists all around us. It's a topography. It's continuous. It's not discrete. We produce electromagnetic fields ourselves, varying states of consciousness. We have our brain waves and all those sorts of things. If we were to imagine electromagnetic fields, just for a second, let's pretend that they were visible, despite what I said earlier. If we were to pretend for a second that they were visible, it'd be a little bit like being under the sea. You know when you're under the sea and you can't really see anything at all because it's just everywhere. That's what you need to think about when you think about electromagnetic fields, because they are everywhere. If we could see them, we couldn't actually see them. And finally, Hertzian space. Hertzian space is actually a term that was, as far as I know, first used by Anthony Dunn, an industrial design theorist, at the end of the 90s. He used this word, Hertzian space, to talk about basically the electromagnetic territory within which our artifacts operate. And he actually threw down a challenge that designers need to explore the possible sensual and poetic experience of this industrially produced new materiality. He said that wasn't being explored enough. I hope I can. Well, I haven't really risen to that challenge. More, I'd quite like to respond to that challenge, but before I can actually respond to it with my projects, I've been trying to kind of get a feel of what this kind of electromagnetic space really is. So that's the sort of thing I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about 4 projects, and then I'm going to briefly sum it up at the end. Very, very quickly. First project. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, called Japanese Whispers. I wanted. This was actually an attempt at kind of getting my first sort of toe dipping into the region of Hertzian space. So I was interested in all the articles that were going around talking about the microwave powers of mobile phones and things like that. So the first thing I thought was, well, how many mobile phones would it take to cook an egg? And I calculated, and I think it worked out as about 103 mobile phones. If you could get them all to phone at the same time and have a little pot underneath, you could actually very slowly boil an egg. So in order to test this out, I thought, well, I've got to get 103 mobile phones. And actually nobody wanted to give me 103 mobile phones in order to prove how dangerous they were. And so I started sort of thinking about other ways that I could use these mobile phones. And it occurred to me that what I really want to know is try and get to grips with what this Hertzian space, what the sort of default material of it is. And this is where the name of the project comes in, which is, you must know the children's game Chinese Whispers, or otherwise known as the telephone game. This was done in Japan, which is why it was called Japanese Whispers, and the fact that it's the name of a good Cure album. Basically, let's see if we can get some sound here. Can you hear any sound? Ooh, I've got to plug that in. So basically what it is, I just put all these mobile phones in order to create basically feedback loops. The idea here was that I wanted to get, as I said, this sort of the default sound of Hertzian space. Now, everything you're hearing is actually, it comes out of the system itself. It's from the hardware, from the analog to digital conversion. This is the kind of ghostly sound of Hertzian space, which comes through this sort of iterative process of transforming audio from analog into digital, into analog into digital, and you get all sorts of different sounds depending on which ways you have the phones call each other. Now, of course, mobile phones have transformed the way we relate to each other and relate to space. And I think, actually, when you talk to somebody on the mobile phone, it's not just that you're connected to them. It's also the fact that the connection is atrocious. I mean, you know, how many times have you fallen out with somebody because the phone connection dropped just at that crucial moment and they thought you hung up on them? Or on the other hand, you know, how many times did you actually hang up on somebody and then you pretended that it's a dropped connection? So I was basically interested in this idea of kind of finding this material behind all of this, which is the purpose of this project. It was also, just coming to the end of the description of this project, it was the first time I actually wanted to experiment with getting people themselves to produce something. So I had to invite lots of people to bring their mobile phones to actually get the thing going. Okay, next project. This was Sky Air. So, do I have some water? Yeah. It looks like whiskey. No, vodka. So, we've become quite aware of electromagnetic fields, partly for health reasons. We're worried about what they're doing to our brains, what they're doing to our bodies. We're worried about being near to phone masts or being underneath power lines. Actually, electromagnetic fields, as I said earlier, do exist naturally as well. It's only recently that human beings have actually started contributing to this cacophony with their mobile phones, their pagers, their garage door openers, the radio broadcast, television broadcast, all these sorts of things. In fact, every time you make a phone call, you're rippling Hertzian space. And every time you make a phone call, there's a little sort of pulse of microwaves going out of that. Now, actually, you must have noticed this phenomenon when you're talking on a landline and you receive a mobile phone call. somewhere else. You hear this sort of galloping beat. That is basically microwaves inducting into the lines. We're also aware of how mobile phones affect us kind of in the same way that doors and walls and windows do. You know, earlier I had to make a phone call, so I had to actually go up to this window in order to get a decent connection. I had to actually find a place where I could, it was almost like looking out the window with my mobile phone, because over here there was a wall, there was a barrier to my connection to the person I was trying to talk to. I was wandering around my studio one day, and again, sort of realizing that there were parts of it where I could connect and other parts where I couldn't. And I realized that actually, if you followed the bars, the signal bars on your mobile phone, you could actually sort of map out the Hertzian territory. You could sort of do, okay, we've got 5 here, we've got about 4 here, 3 here, 5 up near the window, and you could actually start drawing maps of this electromagnetic space. Of course, it'd be a lot easier to use what's called a Gauss meter, but it's kind of nice just using a mobile phone. So you can basically draw a map of this Hertzian territory. That too, yes. There's all sorts of things overlapping each other. I mean, remember that actually electromagnetic fields are everywhere. When you're actually measuring it with one mobile phone, you're only measuring a particular, for example, as you said, a particular phone company. If you used a 3G phone instead of a CDMA phone, you might be actually getting something totally different as well. So anyway, I wanted to basically try and visualize this. And the first plan was actually to create this sort of big network. And I thought, okay, work like a two-dimensional radar. You know the way a radar sweeps across things and lights things up. Actually, I'd make a sort of 3D radar that would sweep upwards. Because, of course, I didn't want to go for putting sensors and outputs everywhere, because then I'd have that whole under-the-water phenomenon that you can't actually see anything because it's all there. So I had this idea of basically creating a big platform of balloons with sensors in them that would rise up into the sky, and it'd have to be quite big because I'd want to see a good amount of variation across the surface. I'm going quite quickly here just to explain, to get to the end of Sky Air. Basically, the plan was to create this large 30-meter wide cloud made up of 1,000 helium balloons, inside each of which is a sensor that's measuring electromagnetic fields. And inside each of the balloons, you also have 6 LEDs that would mix to make millions of colors. And you could actually get this thing rising up and changing color as it encountered different electromagnetic fields. But it occurred to me that if I did that, if I put mobile phones into the cloud also, stick with me on this, if I put mobile phones into the cloud, then when people phone into the cloud, they would actually be changing this Hertzian space. They would be creating these ripples in Hertzian space. Why would they phone into a cloud? Well, one of the reasons they might phone into the cloud, and one of the reasons they did phone into the cloud, is because what they could listen to are called whistlers and spherics. Now, whistlers and spherics are they're actually a natural form of electromagnetic broadcast, bouncing around in the atmosphere. You'll hear some in a moment. It sounds like whale song, and it really is a sort of natural electromagnetic sound. So the idea was that you would phone into the cloud to listen to the electromagnetic sounds of the sky, and as you did that, you'd actually affect the electromagnetic field, and you'd affect what you're seeing. Moving quickly along here. The obligatory sort of architectural models, testing how to fly this thing. This was a sort of Gaudi experiment, the thing where you hang stuff upside down in order to figure out how it's going to be when it's right side up, because gravity is symmetrical. I had to do this because I'm talking about something that's going to be 30 meters wide, which is going to have a potential lift. In other words, a load on the cables of about a ton. So I had to know how it was going to work in the air. Lots more experiments. Lots of dealing with bits of electronics and stuff like that. And then finding a site. I finally got permission to do this at Greenwich Park. In fact, originally it was supposed to go in front of Queen's House at the National Maritime Museum. Eventually it got it actually got bigger and it went into their backyard, which is basically Greenwich Park. And again, just going quickly through the experiments here. Of course, it was, you have this kind of slightly stupid idea to send thousands of things up into the air and risk your life with sort of thousands of kilograms of lift and have things crashing around, and you've got to, at the same time as everyone's worried about terrorist activities in London, go to the Civil Aviation Authority with a very dodgy sounding name and say, can I fly lots of electronics in the sky? So it took good several months to do these sorts of experiments. That kind of gives you an idea of the scale of it. That is one module, and the final thing was actually 37 modules. So when you see the video in a second, because it takes place at night, yeah, so you can't actually see anything else. You only see the thing. You can't really tell what scale this thing is going to be. Actually, that gives a better idea. Can you see that over there? So we're talking about the Royal Observatory down here, and this thing is going to go up to a height of about 100 meters. Experiments with electronics, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, maybe I'll just let this video play for a second. It's going to be about 8 minutes long, and it's going to show the setup and the actual flight. And maybe just talk over it for a second. So there we have it, a nice sort of lovely day in the park. It was originally meant to happen in May, but there was biblical weather on the day, so we had to cancel it and do it in September instead. You basically get a balloon, you put it in from the bottom, you actually put it inside the net. So this is why you'll have 2 or 3 people there, because one person might actually be holding the ring, another person will be holding the net. Apart. 35 people on the day actually setting this up, so it was balloon quite an involved into process. The net, and you'll see there's a plastic valve here. You stick this inside it, and then you just push. And as soon as you've done it a little bit, then it won't actually fall out. Instructions on how to build your own cloud. Yeah, when it's being Of course, one of the difficulties in getting this thing up in the air is you've got to have enough helium to lift the whole thing. And in order to have enough helium, you've got to make sure that the balloon number 1000 has still got as much buoyancy as balloon number 1. So we had to develop these little valves that enabled very quick inflation. Throughout the day, we're sort of running around. Looks very calm now, of course, but it doesn't feel like that all day.
Sorry, excuse me. Are you busy?
Actually, maybe I will just like quit this. Yeah. I'm going to show you the video directly so I can get right to the end. So this is the final sounds we hear of the over there in the corner you saw the Royal Observatory, which you might see in the daytime picture, so that gives an idea of how big this thing was. It really was about 30 meters in diameter. There it is, down there. So here, now we're up at a height of about 80 meters there, I think. And what's happening is that they're responding to the electromagnetic field. It actually goes through a number of different modes, sometimes responding to the EMF, and sometimes actually coordinating to create patterns from mobile sensors and patterns around the different energy. So here it is kind of synchronized, which is why you get this sort of strange flashing around, because each of the sensors is communicating in each way to nearby sensors. That might give a better idea of the sort of scale of it. Anyway, that's that.
How did you choose the colours? I'm just interested aesthetically. Why, what does purple mean? What does blue mean? Are you actually mapping into different kinds of
Basically, actually, each of them can create any one of a million colors. And it goes through different modes. Because I had no way to calibrate the sensors without actually sending it up there. So I could only calibrate them by doing the whole thing. And so what it does is it goes through a number of different modes where sometimes it's sort of mapping at one end of the spectrum, another time it's mapping at the other end of the spectrum, and it's constantly, you can't actually measure off of what you see, if that's what you mean.
No, I just mean if you see two balloons making purple,
Yeah.
they're both doing the same thing.
If they're next to each other, yeah.
But if they're at distance, so you're not necessarily seeing patterns of the same signal, you're seeing patterns of the same colour.
In some modes you are, in some modes you're not. Because in some modes, you know that bit where they're trying to synchronize. That's when they're trying to make sure that they're all at the same stage in their programming. I'm just actually going to go right to the end of the presentation there and show what it really looked like, because I think the video doesn't really show the actual impression of it. I think that would be more like around here. So it was this sort of effect, which I think gives a better idea of the kind of the way the colors came out. Okay, that was Sky Air. So now just to come on to this idea of 802.11 networks. As I said, I'm not going to be talking about the network, I'm going to be talking about the field. Like mobile phones, 802.11 networks are actually quite intricately affected by the hardware, by the fabric of our spaces. If you ever tried to set up a network indoors at home or in the office, you'll know that depending on what your flat is made of, your house, if you've got concrete walls like I do, then actually the signal varies considerably over the extent of your place. I thought I'd do a similar thing to the mobile phone thing and measure what my 802.11 network looked like in my flat. I'm just going to do this very quickly. Can you actually see? So I'm actually going up different levels here, looking at the quality of the network. And then I did a sort of Rachel Whitehead thing of trying to make this sort of block to understand that this really is this is a chunk of stuff which I can't actually see, but which is there. Then I moved on to my living room. And this is where it kind of got interesting. First of all, right at the doorway where I had line of sight, I had, of course, quite a high signal. And then over here, I had nothing for some reason. I have no idea why that was. There was a table nearby. That might be it. But the really bizarre thing for me, you're probably guessing what happened, is that there was this other network that was bleeding into my space. And I don't know about you, but this really felt like somebody had carved a hole in my floor and was sort of like sticking his hands up into my living room and sort of touching things. And I suddenly realized that my feet were actually sticking through the floor and sort of kicking around in his space too, effectively. And so this really got me thinking about the idea that, actually I think Armin talked about the sort of public and private space issue. For me, actually, the issue is not that we're losing public space. The issue for me is that we're actually losing private space. I mean, our data leaks out of our houses. Our devices can be sniffed by anyone with the appropriate bit of hardware and software. I actually don't have any private space anymore. So I began to wonder, how would I create these sort of sanctuaries from this sort of thing? In a data-saturated environment, how do you actually find privacy? Of course, this is one extreme, this idea of sort of covering yourself up in foil so you won't get controlled or anything like that. At the same time, I was actually interested in jellyfish. And I was interested in jellyfish for a number of reasons. First of all, with respect to electromagnetism, they're quite well known for their bioluminescence, the idea that they convert electromagnetic, actually basically electromagnetic energy they convert into fluorescence. I was also interested in their propulsion, but what particularly interested me was this idea that actually jellyfish are paranoid. You know, they sting anything. They're not sort of selective. They don't sort of go out of their way to sting something. They just sting anything that hits them. And it occurred to me that this is like an extreme firewall. So what I really want to do is kind of create jellyfish for the city that would float around as these sort of extreme firewalls, basically blanking out everything underneath them. So you couldn't make phone calls. You would have no network. You would have no sound. You wouldn't hear anyone. You wouldn't even. It would actually be cooled so that you wouldn't even. If you sat down somewhere, you wouldn't even have the warm seat left behind by a previous visitor. This would be the ultimate in private space. At the same time, it would actually be sheltering you from the gaze of the surveillance satellites above. And these things would be floating around. I calculated that it would be about 4 kilograms, which, following my buoyancy experiments with Sky Air, I thought I could probably manage with hot air and basically working off the electromagnetic inductance from things like mains, cables, and stuff like that. It could actually charge itself up. And the idea is that these things would basically wander around the city, flotsam and jetsam. They have to keep moving, of course, because if they were static, then the governments or corporations would actually shut them down, capture them. And so they would just sort of drift around like these butterflies and jellyfish around the city, the only bits of private space that you could find. I'm getting a bit behind here. I'll just finish with a quick description of a project. Having looked at mobile phones and the 802.11 networks, this is a project I'm just starting. I'm actually interested in the actual effects, the physiological effects of electromagnetic fields on people. Now, one place where electromagnetic fields have been particularly important is in haunted spaces. I don't know if you know, but there's actually a good correlation between haunted reportings and power lines. At the same time, it has been reported that, or it has been noted, that the incidence of haunted of reportings has actually gone down where there are mobile phone use. And it's been posited that either we're kind of scaring them away with our electromagnetic fields, or perhaps that we're actually too busy talking on the phone to report. Anyway, the idea of this project was, again, moving quickly through it, was to look at how to create, because nobody had actually done this. They've measured things in haunted spaces. They've measured things like the electromagnetic fields. They've measured the infrasound. They've measured the things like humidity fluctuations, temperature fluctuations. But nobody's ever kind of thought, well, okay, why don't I see what happens when I put them all back together and try and create the haunted sensations. The purpose here, of course, is not to prove or disprove hauntings. More, it's actually to look at the perception of space and how we construct our space through our perceptions. And this is going to be some information about electromagnetic fields and their effects. And this is just a drawing of the installation as it'll be. We have the electromagnetic field coming out of what's called a Helmholtz coil at the other end. And I should say that this is, health and safety is all fine because the peak level of the field is actually less than what you get off of the geomagnetism. Just to wrap up, I wanted to talk very quickly about GPS and RFID as it relates to architecture. I should have asked this at the beginning, but how many people here are actually architects or fall under that camp? So not many at all. So this might have actually not been very interesting for anyone. Apologies for that, because I had thought, well, Architecture Association, I'm going to be talking to architects. And I was going to actually do a sort of a spiel here about trying to convince architects to be interested in GPS and RFID, which they're not really. The reason I wanted to sort of beseech you 3 or 4 back there, was that GPS, which is, of course, global positioning system, RFID is this technology which is supposed to take the place of barcodes and be able to track people and objects through systems and all that kind of thing. These technologies are actually crucial to what's called ubiquitous computing. And ubiquitous computing is what's known as the third wave of computing. In other words, where computers disappear into the fabric of our lives. There's computing all around us. Now, the problem is that most of the people working on UbiComp, as it's known, systems are basically in a sort of computer science end of the spectrum. And so they're dealing with things like efficiency, verisimilitude, seamlessness. Whereas architects, who are also designers of spaces, I think they can kind of deal more with the idea of lyrical spaces, which is why I beseech architects to get involved in somehow in this sort of discussions. Because, of course, GPS and RFID have grave privacy concerns as well. And I think architects might have a lot to say about that. Yeah, skipping blah, 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 blah. Well, to summarize, I think the point is that this Hertzian space affects us and that we affect the Hertzian space. I think it's vital at this stage for architects and others to consider the wider aesthetic, ethical, and lyrical implications that this condition affords us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Usman. Okay, well, before we move downstairs, there are some drinks downstairs. Well, there will be some drinks downstairs and some demonstrations. Before we move on to questions, I think I should probably just mention that maybe some of these ideas that Usman was bringing up later in his talk, we're going to touch on in subsequent Wireless London talk series. The next one will feature Joe Walsh and John Bell, and we'll deal with the semantic city. So we'll start to look at maybe kind of distributed computing platforms and different notions of location and awareness and devices and stuff like that. So the other thing that I wanted to say really was that I think came from both Armin's and Usman's talk, which is that what the talk series and also the project in general is trying to do is to look at not specifically 802.11 networks. That's really not the idea at all. All of these technologies, all of these devices, all of these protocols and uses of different bits of spectrum are under discussion, and they're not just under discussion in this environment. They're being discussed in industry, in government, in the negotiations between hobbyists and people building things, and also just in the way that things get built. And what hopefully will this series of talks, and I'm hoping that maybe more architects will come to subsequent Wireless London talks and other events, is to try and throw some of this, some of these discussions that happen on a technological level, where decisions are really made in terms of what becomes available to the mass market and what people build from that. But to take some of these discussions and really make a case for their discussions in a cultural sphere, and to try and bring them into negotiations through cultural projects and awarenesses of locality. And anyway, so that's just a bit of propaganda for next month's talks. Are there any questions? Do people want to talk in this context, or move downstairs and have a drink and look at some things? Because we can talk down there as well. Yes.
One, two. About 4 years ago, about 5 of us got all of our mobile phones together, took a piece of cling film, put it over an egg, and called each other for about 10 minutes. It didn't completely cook the egg, but it was distinctly much whiter. So that was 4 years ago when the mobile phones splattered out a lot more RF than they do now. But it's still pretty scary, because it was about the same distance between the phone and the egg as it is from the phone and our brains, and it was getting whiter.
Who's talking? I can't actually see, sorry. Oh, there you are.
So yeah, something to think about.
So it only took 5 phones?
Yeah, it's just 5 phones, piece of cling film to get right up close to the egg.
Uh-huh.
You know, because the power of the RF goes to the square of the distance. So you want to get it really close. We had them all just talking to each other.
My calculation was 103, so I guess I was...
I think the mobile
That might have been the
phones
older ones.
Yeah, I think 2 of them were analog.
Uh-huh.
3 of them were the newer ones. And they're
Wow.
American, so they're obviously not so good.
Interesting.
Anybody else got any interesting experimental results to share?
Just a little tip, because the field drops off as a square, as lots of people know, so the field at this distance is almost negligible compared with that, and that is really not a good idea. It's the proximity of the RF to the brain that's the problem. And the field drops, so use Bluetooth or whatever. Try not to do this, and you'll find you'll live a little bit longer, maybe, if you're really lucky. Oh yeah, it's negligible. It's about 1 milliwatt. The other thing for the architects to remember, or those who oppose masts, the transmitters in these things drop their power depending on the signal they receive. So if, for instance, there were a cell site just sort of outside here or across the road and you get a really strong signal, the amount of power that this puts out would drop accordingly. And it can drop to very, very low levels indeed. And that's why you find, as one of the reasons, in fact, that the network, phones are lasting longer is the network's getting bigger, and when it transmits, and your phones transmit all the time, not just when you're talking, there's a sort of voting system every now and then. The network says, who's on? Oh yes, and an answer, so it transmits times other than when you're using it. So architects might want to think about incorporating provisions for cell sites, or incorporating routes for RF to get through the building without it getting lost. I mean, that's a sort of serious thing for architects to think about. And if they want any RF consultants, I'd be happy to help. Okay.
There you go, you heard it here first, folks. These talks might not just be a fascinating evening of entertainment, also could save your brain. Anyone else? Any other safety tips?
This isn't a safety tip, it's a social observation. I'm intrigued by this difference between fields and networks, although I have to say I'm principally interested in the networks, because what strikes me immediately is that in thinking the difference between field and network, at least in terms that was described tonight, one has led to the difference between nature and society. It seems to me that networking is a social phenomenon. Fields are a kind of supernature, and it might be worth thinking that through a bit. One might say that field workers are landscape architects, and networkers are social architects.
For the people at the back there. Question for Armin. You're talking about wireless networks, and so once you've got the network in place, what kind of applications could people use them for? I mean, you mentioned telephony, but what other kind of services could you offer over a wireless network?
Well, basically any kind of service that you can operate on the wired internet also. Yeah.
But are there any, so online you can do things like video streaming and that kind of stuff, but are there any kind of location-based or kind of, like applications that are unique to wireless networks?
That's, I think, more in an experimental stadium at this point. I mean, that would open up another big discussion, that one between free networks and locative media. I'm not really aware of many projects from the locative media side which specifically refer to free networks. Mostly they seem to be focusing on mobile phones, which I find a bit of a pity, because with a mobile phone you always have this kind of commercial octopus behind it that you're feeding with your creativity.
Okay, there's a lady over there with a hand up.
There's a project in New York in Bryant Park where they set up a free wireless network, and one of the objectives of the network was to build these social networking applications on top of it. And so they did a lot of research as to find out, I mean, they didn't come up with any conclusive answers, but one of the applications was one of the things they tried to do was to link it to events that were going on in the park, so that they showed films and so on, and they tried to have applications that would help people, meet up, for example. So instead of having what people used to do, they'd have like a big sign or a balloon or something to say where they were, and so they had an application that used the network instead to do that. I mean, maybe the balloon was more effective way of doing it, but so those are the kinds of things they're trying to find analogues of physical things that they could to use the network for. So, an example.
Hi. In terms of the way we live, as architects, do you think we should be designing homes different? For instance, if you think about the introduction of central heating, it changed the way people live in terms of gathering around the fire and that kind of community of the family, and spread the family throughout the home into different spaces, because people could do different things in different rooms. They didn't need to be around the fire. So in terms of all these networks and wireless technologies, do you think it will majorly change the way we live in our houses and our flats and our homes and our communities? Either.
We'll go first.
Am I on? Yeah. I'm reluctant to say we should design something or we should do this, but I think it's inevitable that it will affect the way people live. And not to deflect the answer, but I think there are two people in particular who are actually, three I should say, who are actually exploring just that. They're Ben Hooker, Pedro Sepulveda, and Shona Kitchen are doing work explicitly about the electromagnetic environment and how it affects us. And I would urge you to check out their work, because partly I really like it, but also because it actually shows. Pedro actually envisages a time where you might visit London because it's got such an incredible electromagnetic habitat. It'd be a sort of tourist destination of sorts. So there's already work going on speculating about this sort of thing.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just also be, again, cautious about saying something like, because we have this or that communication technology, we will have to do exactly this or that. This causal link is what I don't see. Yes, there are all kinds of new technologies coming in, but we cannot say which social use is going to be made of them. And therefore, it's really very difficult to plan in that way and think in that way. And I think that's a good thing, actually.
Hi, a technical question. How do you solve the problem of access to the internet in a distributed free network without, paying a service provider or commercial service provider?
No, so if you want to have access to the internet, at some point you will have to pay for some access provider.
Okay.
But you can share those costs, or people can donate their bandwidth. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the 802.11 network, as sort of promoted by Consume in London, has been around for quite a few years and has been kind of built by a group that's primarily white male geek, characterized by the white male geek. I wonder if you think that's a problem, or if that continues, or if it doesn't matter at all.
I think that's a general problem, that the technology in general is gendered, there's a certain kind of young males thing going on about technology. I think in that area it's also a problem, and I think Julian has put that so nicely in his Wireless London report. Actually, if we really would want to have rapid progress in wireless community networks, we would need a much higher rate of gigs per square mile, because he made this calculation to actually cover a whole area. You need, I think, 1.2 gigs per square mile. What was it? And for the whole area of London, that means you need about 1,500 gigs who are active in free networking, and there are very few actually. So you can see it's a long way to go. And
so it is a problem. I mean, in the the rhetoric of the sort of social utopian ideas, it kind of causes a few hitches if you're dependent on this.
Yeah, that's what I said. I described the utopianism actually as a problem that comes with these fields. And so, as I say, if you formulate it not as an automatic utopia, but if you formulate it as a social project that can be done in the here and now, you will have to look at such kind of mechanisms, of course. So I had this picture which I didn't explain, but at these wireless workshops there were quite a number of young women involved in antenna building and got a lot of pleasure out of doing that. So that was a good healthy sign of some kind of something starting up there. Yeah, this is something that has to be addressed.
There are quite a few white male geeks here with lots of information and knowledge about how to build wireless networks. I think that's something that's worth taking advantage of if you're particularly interested in it. There's a lot of very well-informed and knowledgeable people here that you can ask very specific questions about how you'd like to set up your own network, what you'd need to do it, how long it would take, and lots of other information. I'd like to thank all the speakers and everybody for coming today. It's been a really successful event, and like to see such a wide group. I think there are quite a few shy architects in here, actually, rather than 3 architects, I'm sure. We can move downstairs and carry on the discussion. And if you'd like more information, or I suggest you look at Julian Priest's report, The State of Wireless London, which is available from the wirelesslondon.info website. And please come to the next event on the 15th and look out for other projects that are ongoing. And please join us downstairs for further discussion, and anybody who wishes to showcase projects can. Thanks.